He knows everything about me and my family. I only know so much. Feel loved and protected as well.
You're talking about I'm not there to be having your support. Your support from what? From your exes, the
If I have nothing tomorrow, would you still be engaged to me?
Yeah, because I care about personality. I don't give a what you have.
There is a specific kind of relationship that 90 Day Fiancé has gotten very good at showing us. And it is not the dramatic long-distance love story the promos promise. It is the slower, quieter implosion. The couple where you are watching two people who already know it is not working, but have not yet said it out loud. Darcey and Georgi were that couple, and their season of Darcey and Stacey gave us a front row seat to something that was uncomfortable in a way that went beyond normal reality TV discomfort. My actual thesis here is this. The Georgi situation was not really about cheating. It might not have been cheating at all, and I want to be honest about that up front. What it was about is something that tends to get less airtime because it is harder to package into a thumbnail. It was about a relationship where the intimacy had essentially evaporated, where both people seemed to know it, and where instead of addressing that directly, they each found a way to deflect. Georgi deflected outward. Darcey deflected by going looking for evidence of betrayal that would at least give the disconnection a name. And the show, to its credit, actually captured that dynamic in enough detail that you can see it if you are willing to look past the drama framing. I am not here to defend Georgi. His behavior at those events was, at minimum, tactless, and some of what we saw on camera was genuinely hard to watch if you had any sympathy for Darcey at all. But I also think the narrative that immediately formed around this story, that Georgi was just a cheating opportunist using Darcey for a visa or exposure or whatever the accusation of the week was, misses some of what was actually playing out. Real situations are usually messier than that. This one certainly was. So let me walk through what was actually documented on the show, what I think it means, and where I am genuinely uncertain. Darcey Silva came into her relationship with Georgi Rusev carrying a very visible history. If you watched her on 90 Day Fiancé before the spinoff, you know the broad strokes. She had been through it with Jesse Meester, she had been through it with Tom Brooks, and both of those relationships had patterns that were hard to miss in retrospect. There was always an imbalance, always a sense that Darcey was working harder emotionally than the man across from her. Always a point where the guy said or did something that should have ended things and instead became something she worked to recover from. I am not saying this to be unkind to her. I think a lot of people recognize that pattern from their own lives or from watching people they love go through it. It is real and it is painful, and it is also, unfortunately, something that makes for very compelling television. By the time Darcey and Stacey premiered, and we got a sustained look at Darcey and Georgi as a couple, they were already engaged. The relationship had moved fast in that particular way that the 90-day format tends to encourage. And there was already something a little stilted about how they interacted on camera. Georgi is not a natural TV personality in the way that some cast members are. He tends toward flat affect, which reads differently depending on who is watching. Some viewers read it as cold. Some read it as someone who is simply not comfortable being filmed and is compensating by being very controlled. I honestly do not know which is more accurate, and I think anyone who claims certainty about that is filling in blanks the footage does not actually fill in. What the footage does show, pretty clearly, is that by a certain point in their relationship, the physical intimacy had essentially stopped. This came up on the show directly, and it was one of those moments that felt genuinely uncomfortable because it was clearly a real issue rather than a manufactured argument. Darcey talked about it. The 6-month figure that got thrown around in discussions was referenced in the context of the show's timeline. And while I want to be careful not to present that as a verified exact number, I am working from the show itself, not from any external confirmation. The general claim that they had gone an extended period without physical intimacy was something both of them were essentially acknowledging, even if they had different explanations for it. Georgi's explanation, at least on camera, was essentially that Darcey was always tired, always stressed, always unavailable. And I want to be fair here. That might have been partly true. Darcey was going through a lot during that period, including her very public surgeries and recoveries, which the show documented in detail. But the way Georgi delivered that explanation was cold, in a way that went beyond just being blunt. There was no visible distress from him about the distance. He presented it almost like a logistical problem that was not his to solve. That part, I think, was legitimately telling. When a couple is struggling with intimacy and one partner says, essentially, the reason is that you are never available. The thing a person who is invested in the relationship usually does is express some frustration or sadness about that. There is usually some indication that they are bothered by the distance. What we got from Georgi, on camera at least, was something that read more like indifference. And that matters because it reframes everything that came after. The Miami events became the main flashpoint, and I want to be careful here about what I can actually say versus what became the rumor version of events. What was shown on the show. Georgi and Darcey attended public events together, and at some of those events, Georgi was visibly more socially engaged with other people than with Darcey. There were moments where he was photographed or filmed in close proximity to other women in ways that Darcey found upsetting. He maintained consistently that this was networking, that as someone working in the spa and wellness space, being social at industry and social events was part of how he built his career. Here is where I want to be honest about my own reading. The networking explanation is not inherently implausible. People in hospitality and wellness do socialize for professional reasons. Miami specifically has a culture around that. But the networking explanation also functions very conveniently as a blanket defense that is almost impossible to disprove, because almost any behavior at a social event can be retroactively framed as networking. My read, and I want to be clear this is just my read, is that Georgi was probably not lying when he said that some of his socializing was genuinely professional. I also think he understood exactly how much he could get away with under that framing and pushed right up against that line. That is not the same as cheating, but it is also not the behavior of someone who is trying to make their partner feel secure. The phone situation is where the story gets the most traction in fan communities, and it is also where I feel most obligated to pump the brakes. What was shown on the show was Darcey going through Georgi's phone and finding messages that she found suspicious. The specific message that became the thing people kept referencing about whether the sauna was open was presented as evidence of something inappropriate. Here is what I actually know. That message was shown on the show. Georgi said it was a client inquiring about spa services. Darcey did not believe that explanation, and neither Darcey nor Georgi nor the show provided any additional verification either way. That is where the documented record ends. I have seen people online treat that message as proof of an affair. I have also seen people, including some who seem to have more familiarity with how spa businesses actually operate, point out that a client texting a spa manager to ask if the sauna is open is genuinely a normal thing that happens. Without more context, I cannot tell you which read is correct. What I can tell you is that a text message asking about a sauna does not confirm an affair. It confirms that someone texted about a sauna. Everything beyond that is interpretation, and I would rather say that honestly than pretend there is a smoking gun. What the bar incident added to the picture, though, was harder to explain away. This was documented on the show. Georgi was, at some point, asked to leave an establishment because of behavior that involved, depending on who was telling it, either aggressively hitting on another patron or making himself generally unwelcome. The show addressed this. Darcey brought it up. Georgi's response was, as I recall it, to minimize rather than to genuinely reckon with it. He did not seem particularly embarrassed. That pattern of minimization, the consistent positioning of himself as someone whose behavior was being unfairly interpreted, rather than someone who had caused a problem, was visible across multiple incidents. The Stacey element of this is interesting to me in a way the show mostly played for drama. Stacey coming in to confront Georgi was treated as a sisterly intervention, and in some ways it was, but it also functioned as something else. It meant Darcey did not have to be the one to hold the line directly. She outsourced the confrontation. And Georgi, who was already good at deflecting Darcey's concerns, was not going to be any more accountable to her sister. What actually happened in that conversation, at least on camera, was that Georgi managed the situation without really engaging with it. He stayed calm, he stayed controlled, he said the right enough words, and nothing was actually resolved. I am not saying this to criticize Darcey's decision to involve Stacey. I understand why she did it. When you are inside a relationship and the other person has consistently made you feel like your concerns are irrational, it is genuinely helpful to have someone else in the room who can confirm that no, this is actually a reasonable thing to be worried about. But the show made it look like the confrontation accomplished something, and I do not think it did. The confrontation that got the most attention was the one where Darcey very publicly, in front of other cast members, brought up the intimacy issues and specifically addressed Georgi's, let's say, contribution to the physical side of things in a way that was clearly designed to embarrass him. And it worked. That moment landed hard, and it was clearly intended to. I want to say something that might be a little unpopular. I understand why she did it, and I also think it was a mistake. Not a moral failing, just a tactical one, because it shifted the conversation from the real question, which was whether this relationship had anything left in it, to a completely different arena where now Georgi's ego was the thing being managed. And men like Georgi, in my observation, are much better at defending their ego than at engaging honestly with emotional reality. That move gave him something to push back against, rather than something to reflect on. The gaslighting piece of this is real, I think, but it is also worth being precise about. Gaslighting as a concept has gotten applied so broadly that it sometimes loses meaning. What was actually visible in their dynamic was Georgi consistently positioning Darcey's concerns as evidence of her insecurity or jealousy, rather than as responses to his actual behavior. When someone does that repeatedly, it does create real doubt, not because the concerns were wrong, but because you start to second guess your own perception when it is constantly reflected back at you as the problem. Whether Georgi did this consciously or whether it was just his default way of avoiding accountability, I genuinely cannot say. Both are possible. Now, the counter-argument. The version of this story that is most charitable to Georgi, and I think it deserves a fair hearing, goes something like this. He was a private person who did not want to be on television in the first place, in a relationship that moved faster than he was comfortable with, dealing with a partner who had a lot of emotional intensity and a very public profile. His flatness on camera might have been self-protective rather than indifferent. The networking defense might have been mostly true. The intimacy issues might have genuinely been about stress and timing and incompatibility rather than deliberate withdrawal. And Darcey, by her own patterns and her own admission at various points, did bring significant anxiety into her relationships in ways that could make them harder to sustain. I think all of that is at least partly true. I do not think it excuses the bar incident or the phone situation, whatever that was actually about. But I also think the picture of Georgi as a calculating villain who was just using Darcey never fully held up when you watched him on camera. He seemed more like someone who had checked out of the relationship and did not know how to handle that without causing a different kind of damage. And that is what I actually think happened here. I think Georgi checked out. I do not know when or why. It might have been early, it might have been gradual. But by the time we were watching their season, the relationship was already over in every way that mattered. And both of them were staying in it for reasons that had more to do with the show's structure and their own patterns than with any actual future they were building together. Darcey stayed because she wanted the relationship to work and because she is someone who holds on. Georgi stayed because, whatever else was going on, leaving would have required a directness he did not seem to have. The self-sabotage framing that a lot of people use when talking about Darcey is something I find both accurate and a little too easy. Yes, her pattern of choosing unavailable or dismissive men is visible across her public relationships. Yes, there is something in how she approaches romance that keeps landing her in similar situations. But the word self-sabotage can sometimes function as a way to put all the responsibility on the person who got hurt rather than on the person who behaved badly. Georgi's behavior, whatever the full truth of it is, was not Darcey's fault. She did not cause him to flirt with other women at events. She did not cause the intimacy to disappear. She contributed to a dynamic, as both people in any relationship do, but the specific things he did or did not do are on him. What I keep coming back to when I think about this story is that moment during the group confrontation when Darcey chose public humiliation over private conversation. Because that choice, whatever you think of it, was a tell. You do not humiliate someone publicly unless you have already given up on the private version of the conversation. That moment was not a woman fighting for her relationship. That was a woman documenting for herself and for everyone watching that she had been disrespected and she wanted it on record. I think she knew somewhere that it was already over. The show just had not caught up to it yet. For Darcey specifically, there is a pattern worth naming honestly, not to diagnose her or pathologize her because I am not qualified to do either of those things, but to observe that she has consistently, across the relationships we have seen, ended up in situations where she is more emotionally present than her partner, where she is more willing to fight for the relationship, and where the fight itself becomes a kind of proof of love that she needs to perform. That dynamic is exhausting for the person inside it, and it tends to attract partners who are either emotionally withdrawn or who are willing to let her carry the weight without carrying their share. Whether that changes for her, whether she finds something different, is not something any of us watching her on television can know. What I will say is that the Georgi chapter, as messy and uncomfortable and unresolved as it was, at least surface that pattern in a way that was hard to ignore. Sometimes a relationship has to go badly in a very specific and documented way for it to actually illuminate something. This one did. I do not know if Georgi was faithful to Darcey in the strictest sense. The evidence we have from the show is genuinely ambiguous, and I am not willing to say he cheated based on a text about a sauna and some unflattering footage at parties. What I do think is that he was emotionally absent, that he prioritized his own comfort over her feelings consistently, and that the relationship had probably run its course before the cameras even showed up. Whether you call that cheating or just a bad match, the outcome for Darcey was the same. She was alone in a relationship that was supposed to be a partnership, and the show let us watch that in uncomfortable detail for long enough that most of us could feel it. That, more than any specific scandal, is what the Georgi chapter actually was. A documentation of what it looks like when two people stay together past the point where the relationship has anything left to give either of them. That is not unique to them, but they were on television, so we all got to see it clearly.